Somos una corredora donde todo inversionista es un gran cliente. Tengas el patrimonio que tengas, tenemos un producto de inversión para ti. Contamos con plataforma online única en Chile con arquitectura abierta. Más de 10.000 clientes confían en nosotros. Desde el 2014 en alianza con Banco Falabella. Presencia en Perú y Colombia, además de Luxemburgo y sus más de 60 oficinas en España.
Nuestro compromiso es practicar una cultura verdaderamente enfocada en el cliente y así convertirnos en una entidad de referencia en inversiones en Chile, como lo somos en España. Para esto, contamos con un excelente equipo humano y tecnología de punta. Agradecemos y valoramos mucho su confianza.
This morning, we are delighted to have with us two renowned and distinguished economists who also provide us two different and complementary angles on the economy and financial markets in the post-COVID world. Let me introduce you to Mr. Niall Ferguson, one of the best historians, perhaps the best of economics and finance, author of such iconic works as The Ascent of Money, Doom, The Politic of Catastrophe, The Square and the Tower, or Degeneration. Along with him, Mr. Juan Carlos Ureta, founder and president of Renta 4 Bank, the parent company of Renta 4 Broker in Chile, and a person of recognized prestige and a long financial career, who has founded and promoted with great success an innovative investment bank, which is leading the transformation of finance in Spain and Chile. Allow us to continue by cordially welcoming our attendees and emphasizing that today's content are both structural and cyclical problems, which seem to repeat themselves, as Mr. Niall Ferguson has also suggested. It should be noted, however, that business cycles are not inevitable, but rather a consequence of interventions. The first signs of inflation are already demonstrable in 2021. Which would confirm generally accepted beliefs about the risk of expansionary policy and the degradation of purchasing power of money, although that this implies for savings and investments. We are experiencing a transformational moment where responses to this crisis have been both of unimaginable magnitudes and also, in some cases, questionable efficacy and legitimacy. Therefore, the analysis presented in today's event will serve to better understand the present, where Mr. Niall Ferguson and Mr. Juan Carlos Ureta will certainly be able to enlighten us and share their opinions regarding the appropriateness or otherwise of monetary and fiscal measures adopted by both central banks and government, as well as the role of the state and the market in the development of countries. They will also analyze the path forward from post-COVID world and how the crisis, which began in 2020, will affect our country, which despite originating as a health crisis, has been treated as a financial one. And why do some societies and states respond to catastrophe so much better than others? We feel confident that this conversation, taking place as it does between two leaders in these matters, will be both fascinating and provide fodder for this debate to continue at both a national and international level. Finally, allow me to present our moderator for today's conversation, Isabel Ramos Geldres, editor of International Section in Diario Financiero.
Thank you very much, Arturo, for your words. And good morning for all the audience. On behalf of Diario Financiero and Renta 4, we are very glad to have with us today two important panelists who will join a conversation about the post-COVID-19 world. For the last year and a half, the world experienced a pandemic. As a way of protecting us, especially the most vulnerable, which were the elderly, governments across the world decided to impose lockdowns. The mobility was reduced considerably. The delivery industry flourished, and homeschooling became the rule. But that had an enormous impact on our economy. Millions of jobs were lost, supply chains were broken, and now we're experiencing a steep rise in inflation. The task for our governments and central banks in the next couple of years won't be easy. To talk about the challenges and opportunities that the post-COVID economy presents, we have two important guests. I would like to welcome Niall Ferguson, Scottish historian, writer, and professor. He has specialized in economic and financial history. He is the Milbank Family Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. In 2004, he was named as one of magazine's 100 most influential people in the world. His documentary, The Ascent of Money, won an International Emmy Award for Best Documentary in 2009. He has written 16 books, the latest of which is Doom, The Politics of Catastrophe, where he arguments with various examples that the governmental bureaucracy has never been ready to react properly when disasters occur. Also with us today, we have Juan Carlos Ureta. He's the president of Renta 4 Banco, the first Spanish bank specialized in wealth management and capital markets to be listed on the stock exchange. He currently combines his obligations at Renta 4 with various positions, among which are president of the Financial Studies Foundation, president of the Spanish Institute of Financial Analysts, member of the board of directors and the permanent commission of the governing society of the Madrid Stock Exchange. In addition, he works as a consultant for several Spanish and foreign business groups and is the author of numerous specialized publications on legal and financial issues. Welcome to both of you. And now we're going to start our conversation. So first of all, I would like to ask the first question to Mr. Ferguson. During the pandemic, governments have spent millions of dollars to implement cash transfers to help their populations and to buy vaccines. Therefore, debt and deficit have grown considerably. Is a debt-based economic growth model sustainable? What could be the impact on long-term growth and capital markets?
Well, these are very important questions, and I want to begin by pointing out that in a pandemic and a public health emergency, particularly if you decide to prevent people from leaving their homes, prevent them from going to their usual workplaces, you are going to have an enormous economic shock. And most countries that imposed lockdowns saw that last year. It would have been crazy not to offset that shock in some way. There was a risk of economies spiraling into depression. So it was appropriate to use fiscal and monetary means to offset the shock and effectively to pay people relief. I sometimes heard the word stimulus used, but it was inappropriate. This was not a Keynesian policy. This was emergency relief. The big question is how far that fiscal support needs to be continued this year as vaccines are very rapidly returning the world economy to something like normalcy. We can't get rid of COVID, but it's going to become endemic rather than a pandemic. I don't think Chile has a particularly large problem here in international terms. If you compare the trajectory of Chile's debt, it's really quite a modest increase that we see from a very low base. I mean, if you just look at the International Monetary Fund's net debt data, Chile's net debt in relation to GDP was 8% before the pandemic. It's forecast to be 11% this year and 14% next year, while the United States and pretty much every European country would love to be in such a strong position. So I think one should bear in mind that Chile started this crisis from a relatively strong fiscal position by international standards. And for the same reason, I think doesn't need to worry as much as perhaps the United States does about its future debt path.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ferguson. Juan Carlos, would you like to complement something? We can't hear you. Can you please turn on your audio? Okay, just give us a second. Okay, that's fine.
Thank you, Isabel. I would just like to add two ideas to the comments of Professor Ferguson. The first idea is that money is not wealth and debt is not wealth. Money and debt are a powerful tool to create wealth, but only if they are properly used. If not, they destroy value, they destroy wealth. That's what history and economic theory teach us. Of course, you can achieve short-term growth, but really that is short-lived. The second idea is that today the world is living a a tech revolution without precedent, and that's fantastic. That's very good for the long-term growth. But to change the world, you need something more than a tech revolution. You need to fund the investing just to get in track that tech revolution. You need to invest a lot, and you need to do it in the right direction, not in the wrong direction. So what I mean is, tech revolution is a tool. Money and debt are powerful tools, but really you need to base all the shift of the economy in not in debt, but in equity, in capital. And that's very important, because if not, the result is that you will be creating asset bubbles, and you will be creating a giant with feet of clay. You will be wasting your money, throwing your money. So in my opinion, excessive debt produces higher prices for the same assets, and that's not the way. The way is to dedicate capital and money to invest, to create new assets and foster innovation. But in my opinion, today we live not in Chile, but as Professor Ferguson said, in the United States, in Europe, in China, in a world of excess debt and excess money distort the market. And in that sense, my opinion is that we are close to the exhaustion of the model, of debt growth model.
Yes, thank you very much. That's an interesting approach. Niall, during the pandemic period, the role of the state has grown, and there are voices asking for even more interventionist approach. Do you see this as something worrying? Is there less independence between governments and central banks?
Yes, I do worry that much of the expansion of government involvement in the economy necessitated by the pandemic is going to persist even as the pandemic comes to an end. That kind of bureaucratic inertia is something we've seen before. For example, in the 20th century, government controls persisted after both the world wars, and it proved very difficult to remove some of the restrictions that had been emergency measures but became permanent in the post-war period. So we need to learn from the mistakes of the past and remind ourselves of how we managed to revive growth after the stagflation of the 1970s with all kinds of measures of deregulation that brought market forces back into play. Chile, of course, played a leading role in this transformation, pioneering a whole variety of free market reforms that put into practice the ideas of Chicago economists like Milton Friedman. So we mustn't really go back to the 1960s and 70s just because we had a pandemic. I think that in many ways, the economists of the left are overreaching at this point. One can see this in the United States with multi-trillion-dollar fiscal bills going through Congress at a time when the debt path of the United States is obviously unsustainable. US debt to GDP is already past the point it reached at the end of World War II, and the Congressional Budget Office forecasts that it could reach as high as 200% of GDP if we carry on the present path over the coming decades. The good news is that I think the inflationary consequences of some of this fiscal overreach will produce fairly quickly a political backlash. People notice if their real incomes go down, because what they find is that while their wages may go up nominally, the cost of heating their homes or fueling their cars, the cost of things goes up even more. And the lesson of the 1970s is that inflation is fundamentally unpopular. I think that's where the left is going to screw up. I also think that many of the measures that are being taken in the name of averting climate change are liable to backfire and create spikes in energy prices, quite apart from the impact of the pandemic and fiscal and monetary policy. So although I think there's quite a significant risk of overreach, I'm not too worried about it, because I think people are going to notice quite quickly that the policies that are being attempted by left-leaning governments simply are not sustainable and will have to be reversed. I want to reiterate, emergency measures are for an emergency. And history tells us that when the emergency is over, so should the emergency measures be.
That's a very important view or approach, the historical approach, don't repeat the same mistake. And these kind of measures that begin as emergency become the rule. So I wanted to ask Juan Carlos, how do you see this from the market? How do you see the independence of governments and central banks from your view, from the market view?
Okay, one of the consequences of the last two economic shocks, the 2008 Lehman crisis and the 2020 COVID crisis, is the bigger role of governments. People wish to feel more protected by the government, and governments are very happy to expand their reach. As a result, governments have fallen into significant fiscal deficits, and they have found a very effective way to finance their expansion, that is, selling debt to the central bank. The central banks print money, and they buy directly or indirectly the bonds issued by the governments. And well, that's working. That has worked quite well with no inflation, as Professor Ferguson has said, and everybody is very happy with this. And this is possibly this model of monetization of debt is possibly the most important change in economic policy in the 21st century. And well, in my opinion, it is a big. We have a big risk if we think that this is a good model. In the short term, the model works, but in the long term, the model doesn't work, because we are demanding and we are expecting from governments more than we should expect. And again, history shows us that public spending usually is not very efficient, and centralized planning usually doesn't work in terms of growth, in terms of economic growth. And now we have the situation in which even a small rise in interest rates can provoke big problems, big turbulence in the markets and in the economy, because we have a highly indebted economy and we have markets addicted to debt. So, and this connects with the point of the independence of the central banks. In my opinion, central banks have a very delicate task, because we are asking them for something beyond their capacities. Central banks have supported the full weight of the economic challenges in the last decade, and they have now an almost impossible mission to return to a certain level of normality without provoking major economic and financial turbulence. Central banks should be, in that effort, independent not only of the governments, but also of people, and also independent of financial markets, because people and financial markets have created excessive expectation. And central banks should be independent, again, not only of the governments, but also people and markets and financial markets. And this is going to be a real test for the independence of the central banks. There have been moments of the whatever it takes story, probably 2008 and 2012 with the euro crisis, or 2020, but not today. Today is not the moment of the whatever it takes. Today is the moment of coming back to normalization. And this can be challenging for everybody, also for investors. And in my opinion, we should prepare for possible corrections and think long term. It's a big test. It's a big test for the central banks. They should be independent. They are having hard times, and they're having, as I said, a very difficult mission to come back, to reverse their policies of easy money, because it's not easy. It's not, and they will have a very hard task in that.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. You said two important things. One is that central banks should not only be independent from the governments, but also from the public and the financial markets. And also you talked about how public spending is not efficient. So I wanted to ask Niall, in this context, what should be the role of the state and the market in the modern society?
Well, that's a big question, Isabel, and economists have spent the better part of 2.5 centuries trying to figure that out. I think the answer is fairly straightforward, that the role of government, the role of the state, is to provide a framework within which property rights are secure, taxation and monetary policy are on a consistent path, that the size of the state does not exceed what I think would be a reasonable share of gross domestic product, let us say somewhere between a quarter and a third. That public debt should not exceed roughly the size of the economy of gross domestic product. But those are the kind of the ground rules in normal circumstances. What people often forget, and it's an argument I make in my book Doom, is that emergencies, disasters happen. We call some of them natural, like pandemics, and some of them man-made, like wars. But the reality is that disasters are part of history's pattern, and the government often has to increase its economic role in time of emergency. That's why governments exist, because we require protection from disaster, whether it's an invading enemy or an infectious disease. So what's clear is that there must be variation over time in the role of the government. And the norms that I just sketched out are really those that apply in peacetime under normal circumstances. Taking a historical view, it's very clear that the role of government has grown considerably since Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations in 1776, also the year of the American Declaration of Independence. If Adam Smith could come and take a tour of his native Scotland today, which also happens to be where I come from, he'd be absolutely appalled at the size of the state and the intrusive way that the Scottish government meddles in economic life. And even if he came to the United States, he'd be pretty shocked at the scale of government intrusion. And also he'd be shocked by the complexity and lack of transparency of the tax code. So my advice to all policymakers is dust down a copy of The Wealth of Nations and refresh your memory about Smith's guidelines, because it's very clear, and history is unequivocal on this, that the closer you can get to Adam Smith's ideal of a relatively small government that secures property rights, creates consistent monetary fiscal policy, the better your economy will do. And there is nothing better in economic terms than high, sustained growth rates that distribute wealth and distribute income to the population. The state cannot do that. That can only come from entrepreneurs, from wealth creators. And the more the government gets in the way of the process of wealth creation, the slower the growth rate will be. That is just economic history.
Well,
Thank you, Niall. Yeah, Juan Carlos, do you want to say something about it?
I fully agree with Professor Ferguson, fully agree. There's no doubt that the post-COVID world is a world in transformation. We want a safer world, we want a cleaner world, a greener environment, more digital, more sustainable, with more better values. And at the same time, there's no doubt that there is a very widespread feeling of inequality among the European and US middle classes. Many people feel like left out of the prosperity, and they are against globalization, and they are against and in some way, the social contract that implicitly has worked during the last decades is now under question. No? There's no discussion about all the above. The discussion is about who should take the lead to build the post-COVID world with these values, with this transformation. Who should take the lead? The state or the markets or the private initiative? No? And really, as Professor Ferguson was saying, most people today turn their eyes to the governments and to the national governments. They are against globalization and they want protection from the national government. No? And in some way, the new mantra is like more state and less globalization and less private initiative. It's like the new mantra, no? The new. But this mantra, more state, less globalization, less private initiative, is not the model of the 21st century. The 21st century society needs more globalization, more innovation, more private initiative. I fully agree with Professor Ferguson, and that is the model, no? And that leads us to because really states are very good for promoting social equality, but they are not good in creating wealth. And the first thing to distribute wealth is to create wealth, no? And that leads us to how, in my opinion, no, to how the companies and the markets should change in this and are changing, in fact, in this post-COVID world, which is what we call the conscious capitalism, or the social role of companies and markets, no? And in my opinion, this is very important. Professor Ferguson has spoken about Adam Smith, no? And I will say, okay, the pandemic has taught us an important lesson. The lesson is that if we don't get an acceptable level of common well-being, we will not be able to reach a good level of personal well-being, of individual well-being. It's a little bit different to the idea of Adam Smith. Adam Smith said, if you pursue your particular interest, you will achieve at the same time general well-being. That is Adam Smith, and that's okay, no? But now it's a little bit different. It's the idea that without a given level of general well-being, you are not going to obtain any particular benefit. In a world of poverty, of disease, of pollution, nobody will obtain personal benefit. That is the change a little bit in the role of companies. Companies, well, they will of course pursue their profit, no doubt, but they will have to know that they have also to promote, to foster social and common well-being, because if not, they are not going to obtain individual profit. That's what we call conscious capitalism. In my opinion, capital markets are very important, and I should like to understand the role of the financial markets in this task. The capital markets are the best mechanism to allocate resources and to finance innovation. The Nasdaq is a very good example. Without Nasdaq, Apple, Amazon, Google, and many other innovative companies would not exist today. And without the financing of the markets, vaccines created in a record time by companies, they would not exist today. This is very clear. So capital markets should play a bigger role in the post-COVID world in order to achieve economic prosperity for all. And that in my opinion, that is very clear. But what happens? Today we have excess debt and we have excess liquidity. And the problem is that with so much money floating around, it is difficult to avoid casino-like behavior. We have seen the SPACs, we have seen the meme stocks, we have seen the cryptocurrencies or crypto assets skyrocketing, social networks moving the markets with this kind of financial influencers. And that is the worst part of the market. So markets really should take the role, should take their enormous responsibility to allocate well resources to foster innovation, to foster that new post-COVID world with better values, with of course with profits for the companies. Of course, that is the key of the capitalism, and that's very clear. But always having in mind this common well-being, because if not, we are not going to obtain this particular benefit. That is my idea. And markets are very important. So no more government, more markets, more polarization, more private initiative, in my opinion.
I think, Juan Carlos, what you're saying is very interesting in the sense that the role of the company has changed and it has a bigger role, with social impact. Or is it's more aware that it has social impact? So I wanted to ask Niall, now talking about Chile, one of the main worries in Chile at the moment is the rise of inflation. There are external factors like oil price and there is disruption of supply chains, but internal factors as well, like the effect of pension funds withdrawals. How do you see inflation pressures? Is it transitory? Is it a transitory phenomenon, or should we prepare for a long-term scenario?
Well, the International Monetary Fund certainly doesn't see Chile as heading into an inflationary period. The inflation rate has gone up, but it's projected to stay stable at 3% over the next 5 years. And that compares pretty favorably with some of your neighbors. Let's remember that Argentina has double-digit inflation already and is, I think, in a really pretty precarious state, having handled the pandemic significantly less well and having, of course, already been in a much weaker economic position because of its default. There's also the case of Venezuela, which has quadruple-digit inflation the last time anybody could get statistics out of that country. So Chile looks like that is not its big headache. I think Chile's problems are really more political than economic, because there is considerable uncertainty, and this predates the pandemic, about the stability of Chile's political system, about the consequences of constitutional rewriting. And that seems to me a bigger concern, because a lot of people, I think, have lost sight of the benefits that the old constitution conferred on Chile's economy. I'm personally somebody who gets a little nervous when Latin American countries scrap their constitutions. That hasn't turned out brilliantly in a significant majority of cases. So my sense is that Chile does not have a big inflation problem, except insofar as the world has. And this is where I think one has to go back to the global perspective to understand exactly how things are going to play out for Chile, which after all is an economy that relies quite heavily on exports of commodities to the rest of the world. If you look at the US, there clearly is some inflationary pressure. The latest data suggests that the Delta wave of COVID cooled down an economy that was threatening to overheat with all the stimulus that was being piled on by the Biden administration. Europe, I don't think, is going to have more than transitory inflation. And bear in mind that the central banks on both sides of the Atlantic have committed themselves to taper quite significantly their asset purchases. Quantitative easing is really going to be turned off next year, even before we start to see a normalization of interest rates. Market interest rates have already shown some signs of life. Just look at the bond market this year. And all of this, I think, taken together, is going to tend to cool things down, and perhaps cool them down more than investors expect. So I'm not sure that at this point, the breakaway inflation story is looking quite as worrying as it did back in February, when former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers warned that we were going to overheat the economy. My sense is that we've had a kind of post-pandemic surge, but it's somewhat tailed off just in the last couple of months. And I don't see how that surge can resume if monetary policy is going to tighten. I'll add one last point. China is a hugely important part of the global economy. It's the second largest economy. It's a very big part of everything that happens in Latin America because of exports to China. The fact that China is in a world of economic difficulty has come as a surprise to many people who thought that China had somehow won the pandemic and was going to lead global growth this year. That is not happening because, as some of us have been saying for a while, demographic pressures and excess corporate debt are creating real headwinds for Chinese growth. And the Evergrande scandal or crisis in the real estate market is the tip of an iceberg of problems for the Chinese economy that are going to really slow it down over the next few years. And that's the main reason why I'm starting to think that inflation's transitory, not something that is going to take us back to the 1970s. If China slows, everybody slows, and the inflationary pressures, I think, will very likely abate in the coming year.
Thank you. I don't know if China's slowing down is a good news for us. It's our main commercial partner. China's a huge investor now. It's investing heavily in our country. And also, China was the main driver of growth during the financial crisis in 2008. We didn't have this lack of growth. I mean, we had a kind of lack of growth, but it wasn't as big as in the developed countries because of China, because China was growing hugely. It was growing and it was buying our products, and we survived because of it. So I think it's not a very good news for us that
Isabel,
China
you were worrying about inflation, and you didn't ask me about growth or export growth. My argument would be that if China is slowing, then that will be disinflationary. Remember, part of what made Chilean growth relatively strong over the last couple of decades was a surging Chinese demand for commodities such as copper.
Yes.
And of course, for the rest of the world, that had an inflationary aspect because surging commodity prices, as we have seen over the last year, turn out to be inflation for the system as a whole. It's not a huge part of inflation, but it's still there. So my point would be that if China is not going to be growing at the kind of rates that the IMF or the World Bank expected just a matter of months ago, if the true growth rate of China turns out to be closer to 3% over the coming decade than to 6% or higher, then I think that means a much less robust profile for demand for commodities such as copper, but it also really does reduce the inflation risk from a global point of view. So yeah, I think there are trade-offs here, as there always are in economics, but I think if inflation's your worry, it's not going to be propelled by Chinese growth, and I don't think in the end inflation is going to be driven by the kind of monetary policy mistakes that we saw in the United States in the late 1960s and 1970s. The way it looks to me today, the Fed is not going to repeat those mistakes, and the world is not heading for a generalized period of inflation. It'll be weak countries like Argentina that get into inflationary trouble rather than the world as a whole.
That's good news. Thank you. Juan Carlos, how do you see inflation in Chile?
Okay, well, I agree that inflation may not be the only concern. Possibly growth is going to be a concern as well. But let us speak a little bit about inflation and inflation in Chile. Consensus is that the rise in inflation is transitory and due to the reopening of the economy. The idea is that there are a lot of elements, deflationary elements in the scenario, and so inflation is just transitory. But this consensus is weakening very rapidly, and we are passing from this concept of a transitory inflation to a persistent inflation. That means to inflation that is going to last something more than we have thought. And this is due to the rise, to the escalation of the commodity prices, and this is due to the supply chains bottlenecks, and this is due to the energy crisis that is very important in inflation and is adding inflation to the world, especially to Europe and China. And really what we have understood is that the big shift in the economy and the transition to the green economy, etc., maybe that we have done it too fast and without fully grasping the enormous investment needed. So inflation we are now considering that it's going to be persistent more than transitory. But I agree that inflation, I fully agree that inflation is not going to be the only concern. Growth is going to be a very important concern. The specter of a back to 70s situation when oil prices skyrocketed and the economy stagnated is quite scary. I know that that's not the central scenario. I agree, that's not the central scenario, but we cannot rule it out. We cannot rule out that we go to an stagnation of the economy with some kind of higher prices because of commodities, because of energy crisis, and so on. The big difference with the 70s is that we are in the middle of a tech revolution, and all the tech revolutions are deflationary, and they foster growth. But on the other hand, as I have said previously, we have excess money, excess debt, and that provokes misallocation, and that has a very negative impact on productivity. And productivity, at the end of the day, is key for inflation and for growth. Regarding Chile, coming to Chile, in the short term, consumption is going to exert pressure on prices in Chile. Consumers are going to spend more in this second part of the year, and that will force the central bank to raise rates. And the Central Bank of Chile did very well the 20th 21st of 21 of August, last August, to raise rates. That is very good idea, and this is the right direction, no? So, but the central bank is going to have a dilemma, no? Because they will have to be quite hawkish. They will have to raise rates when while the Fed is remaining quite dovish. Even if inflation goes up in USA and in Europe, the Fed and the ECB will remain dovish because they cannot reverse their policies quickly. So there's going to be, in my opinion, a problem for the Central Bank of Chile. But the Central Bank of Chile has to stick to this orthodoxy, and they have to stick to raise rates if necessary. And there will not be a problem of inflation in Chile. Probably the main problem will be growth. And yesterday, you published yesterday in Diario Financiero the information that the World Bank has an estimated growth for Chile of 10%, but this year, 10% this year, but it goes down to only 2.4% in 2022 and only to 1.8% in 2023.
Yes.
And that confirms that the problem will not be inflation, especially if Central Bank of Chile does its job, that is going to do. And the problem will be growth. And I agree, and that connects with China. And well, I agree completely with the previous words of Professor Ferguson.
You talked about the gap that's going to be a gap between interest rates here in Chile and the Federal Reserve. I'm thinking about carry trade and all that could happen with that, but that's for another conversation. So you talked about Chile. I wanted to ask Niall, the last time you came to Chile was in February 2019. How do you see the country now after the social unrest and through the constitutional process? Do you think this process will help reduce inequality, or is it too risky in the sense that one of the objectives is to change the economic model?
Well, I think one should always be careful about commenting on a country one hasn't visited in 2 years. And indeed, one should be careful about commenting on a country one doesn't come from. So I'm going to speak in the most cautious terms. It's very clear to me that the motivations behind the campaign for a new constitution are essentially socioeconomic in nature. And I would just say that if you want to address a problem of inequality, and Chile certainly has, by the standards of the OECD, high inequality, then really the wrong way to do that is by rewriting the constitution. Constitutions aren't about outcomes in terms of distribution of income or wealth. That's what the tax system is there for. And each democracy has a method for deciding how much redistribution it wants to have through the tax system. It's called elections. You vote for the party that offers you more or less progressive taxation, and they then implement the verdict, the decision of the electorate. I don't see what this really has to do with the Constitution. The Constitution is designed to create guardrails, rules for political processes. It's designed to create some fundamental guarantees that can't be easily overridden by the normal political process. History tells us that the longer a constitution lasts, the more likely it is to work because it becomes something to which people are accustomed. Tradition matters. It's why the United States Constitution has been amended but not rewritten. And that seems to me something that some Chileans at least have lost sight of. So I've been skeptical about the need for a new constitution. I think that the existing constitution, whatever you think of its origins, has served Chile very well. And really, I can't believe that a new constitution is going to seriously improve income inequality in Chile, because that's just not what constitutions do.
Thank you very much. That's very enlightening. Juan Carlos, how do you see Chile from Spain, and what do you think are the main challenges our country faces?
Okay, well, in principle, Chile is in a good position to face the challenges that the post-COVID world is posing. macroeconomic figures are okay, with government debt around 34-35% of GDP, public spending around 27, well, less than 30% of GDP, inflation rate 3%, estimated GDP for this year 10%. So it's okay, no? From a more qualitative point of view, Chile has been an example of a successful economic model, which has placed Chile in a position of leadership in the region. And there are several more reasons to be optimistic, even the relation with China, even if China is going to slow down, but in the long term, China will be a big factory of growth for the world and for Chile. No? So, and digital infrastructures are very good in Chile, population is young and well prepared, and you have, as of today, you have institutional stability. However, Chile has to solve some problems in order to be successful in the post-COVID scenario, in my view. Recent unrest, the unrest of 2019, shows that there is social discontent. Probably some people think that they have not participated in the bonanza. Of course, inequality has been reduced in Chile, but as I said before, we live in a world in which the social contract accepted for the last 50 years now is being questioned. No? And in my opinion, some services as social services and basic education and other services should be obligatory and free for everybody. You know? So, but having said that, modernization and open economy and market economy, in my opinion, is key for Chile, and to maintain it and to maintain it in the constitution and in the future of the political model. No, we are living in a world that is having a big shift, a big transformation, and in social life and really countries with strong and quality capital markets are able to attract better than others the capital required for this big transformation. I think that we're at the gate of a big transformation that will need funding, that will need investment, that will need money investing. No? And really, if you have a market economy and you have a model that creates trust, confidence, and you have open capital markets, you are going to attract the necessary funding for that big shift. We saw it in Spain in the 90s when we, some media, international media, spoke of the Spanish economic miracle, no? And really the capital markets were key in that transformation. We were happy to live that moment because it was fantastic, no? And it helped a lot the society, Spanish society, in all the progress that we have had in the next decade, no? So Chile, in my opinion, has the most important thing to face all the challenges of the post-COVID world. I mean, it has an economic model based on free market economy that has been able to transform Chile in the last 3 decades. And this is the most important thing. And this is the most important thing because only if you create wealth, you will be able to distribute and to generate social well-being. You know? And this is why I believe that the new constitution and the results of the next elections are so important for Chile. And it is my wish that Chile can find a pragmatic and a workable way to embrace the new social contract and the new realities of the post-COVID world without undermining the model that has proven to be so successful based on an open market economy. That's what I believe, really.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. This conversation, it's been very interesting, but we're getting out of time. So I'm going to ask you the final question to both of you. First of all, Niall, what are the main challenges the world faces? Populism, the rise of inflation, deglobalization. How did COVID-19 reshape the world?
Well, I suspect that many people would answer that question with the words climate change, because we are quite quickly returning to focusing on that particular threat. It's going to consume an immense amount of time and energy as we approach the COP26 conference in Glasgow. I don't underestimate the threats from rising global temperatures, I would just point out that 2/3 of the increase in carbon dioxide emissions since the birth of Greta Thunberg were due to China, and 93% of the increase in coal consumption was the responsibility of China. And until the climate activists grapple with China's role and its dominant role in continuing CO2 emission increases, then I don't think we're having a serious conversation. I would also say that there are other things that you need to keep your eye on by not paying enough attention to the risk of a new coronavirus. Back in January 2020, the world sleepwalked into a pandemic. We should also bear in mind that natural disasters can often be matched in their scale by man-made disasters like wars. And at the moment, as far as I can see, the US and China are on some kind of collision course, not least over the issue of Taiwan. Finally, I think COVID has revealed our extraordinary dependence on the internet as a mode not just of communication, but in fact of running our systems, from our infrastructure to our transport systems. And I think most people at the moment underestimate just how drastic it would be if there were a successful large-scale cyber attack on any of the world's major economies. Even 6-hour outage for Facebook on Monday caused quite a bit of confusion to those people who depend on Facebook for their businesses. So I would say there's really quite a lot of things that we have to keep our eyes on, and simply focusing on one threat like climate change is a sure way of becoming myopic and being blindsided by the next disaster, which may take a completely different form.
Thank you very much. Juan Carlos, what do you think are the main challenges the world faces?
Okay, well, we have a long road ahead of us towards the economic model of the 21st century and to the social model and political model of the 21st century. It's a long road, and it's a bumpy road in some way. I am optimistic, but well, anyway, it's going to be a long and not so easy road, no? The final of this road is, in my opinion, is to get this model that we call conscious capitalism. From a financial point of view, in my opinion, we need to get rid of the excess debt and to capitalize the system. We need to put more equity in the system. Excess debt is not the way, and really, I think we have to capitalize to put more equity on the system from a financial point of view. Markets can help in that. From an economic point of view, we need to foster productivity. Productivity is going down during the last decades, and we need to come back to productivity because productivity is the only key, the real key to sustainable growth. We need to come back to globalization. That, in my opinion, that is key. I know we live now in this world of deglobalization and in this world of blocks. Okay, but that is bad news. We need to come back to globalization, no doubt, from the economic point of view, productivity, globalization, sustainable growth. From a social point of view, we have to foster equality. That is conscious capitalism. We have to promote equality, more equality. We cannot live with those with that huge amount of people thinking that they are not participating. We have to include, and that is necessary, and that is in some way capitalism is obliged to do that to avoid social unrest and populism, because if not, we are going to have populism, and that is really bad. No, so in my opinion, those are the main financial, economic, social, political challenges. In my opinion, maintaining the market economy, the private initiative, that I think that's key, and we have to do it in this long road to the social model of the 21st century. That is going to be, of course, fascinating, no, in some way. That we are going to live it, and that's the part of it. No?
I want to thank you, both of you. It's been very interesting. There's so many subjects to talk about. We covered China, we covered debt, conscious capitalism, we covered so many things, inflation. So I want to thank you both of you, Neil, Juan Carlos, and also Arturo, who was with us before, for being with us today, this morning. I hope everyone connected had enjoyed as much as I did. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Somos una corredora donde todo inversionista es un gran cliente. Tengas el patrimonio que tengas, tenemos un producto de inversión para ti. Contamos con plataforma online única en Chile con arquitectura abierta. Más de 10.000 clientes confían en nosotros. Desde el 2014 en alianza con Banco Falabella. Presencia en Perú y Colombia, además de Luxemburgo y sus más de 60 oficinas en España.
Nuestro compromiso es practicar una cultura verdaderamente enfocada en el cliente y así convertirnos en una entidad de referencia en inversiones en Chile, como lo somos en España. Para esto, contamos con un excelente equipo humano y tecnología de punta. Agradecemos y valoramos mucho su confianza.